Imagine a bed forged of solid iron, 13 feet long, sitting cold and empty amidst the ruins of a fortress that once scraped the sky. A relic not built for rest, but as a monument to a man who believed he was too large for God to topple. This is the untold story of Og, king of Bashan, the last of the ancient giants, a tyrant who scoffed at Moses and the approaching Israelites until the very air around him grew heavy with a terrifying judgment. But how does a warrior who breaks mountains fall without a single sword touching his skin? The answer lies in a divine silence that is louder than any battle cry. Before we unlock this ancient mystery, make sure to subscribe to Guardians of the Covenant, smash that like button, and share this video with others, because what you are about to hear is a warning that echoes through eternity. This isn't just a legend of steel and blood. It is the chilling account of the moment human pride collided with divine holiness, proving that when the Creator steps onto the field, even the mightiest giants are brought down to their knees in an instant. Imagine a bed forged not of soft linen or cedar wood, but of cold, solid iron. It stretches 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, a massive, unforgiving structure that looks less like a place of rest and more like a cage or a coffin. It sits in the heart of a fortress that scrapes the sky, a silent testament to a man who believed he was too large for the world to hold, and certainly too powerful for God to humble. This iron bed did not belong to a myth, but to a memory, a terrifying reality named Og, the king of Bashan. He was the last of the Rephaim, the ancient giants who once walked the earth like gods, making the ground tremble beneath their feet. But this is not a story about how strong a man can be. It is a story about how fragile human pride truly is when it comes face to face with the divine. What happens when you build a life, a career, or a kingdom on the belief that you are untouchable? What happens when you trust in your own iron walls, only to find that the enemy approaching isn't coming to fight with swords, but with a silence that shakes the soul? The story of Og is a terrifying mirror for every one of us. It forces us to ask, what iron beds have we built? And will they stand when the Creator steps onto the field? Before we unlock the secrets of this ancient battle and the holy hush that brought a giant to his knees, please take a moment to subscribe to our new channel, Guardians of the Covenant. Hit the like button and share this video, because the message of Bashan is one that the modern world desperately needs to hear. It is a reminder that the bigger the pride, the harder the fall. Long before the Israelites stood on the banks of the Jordan, before the walls of Jericho crumbled into dust, there was Bashan. It was a land of stark beauty and intimidating darkness, a place of black basalt rock and ancient oak forests where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than anywhere else on earth. And ruling over this land of stone and shadow was Og. To understand his fall, you must understand his height, not just his physical stature, but the towering arrogance of his soul. Og was not merely a king. He was a remnant of a forgotten age, an era where brute force was the only law. His people didn't just serve him, they worshipped him. They called him the Thunder of the North, the living pillar. He began his life wandering the basalt caverns with his father, learning the ways of the giants. It was his father who once looked at the young, growing boy and offered a warning that would echo for decades. Strength is a gift, my son, but it becomes a curse the moment it refuses to kneel. Og heard the words, but he did not listen. As he grew, his body outpaced the world around him. Wood cracked beneath his weight. Horses buckled under his stride, and so his pride grew to match his frame. He ordered the construction of the iron bed, not because he needed it for comfort. Iron is cold and hard, but because he wanted a monument. He wanted every visitor, every ambassador, and every subject to look at that black metal frame and feel small. It was a declaration. I am permanent. I am unbreakable. For years, Og sat on his throne, sipping wine from goblets the size of buckets, laughing at the world below. When news first arrived of a wandering tribe of escaped slaves coming up from the desert, Og dismissed it with a wave of his massive hand. Israel. They were dust. They were refugees wearing sandals, following a shepherd named Moses and chasing a pillar of cloud. What did they know of war? What did they know of power? Og had fortresses with walls that reached the clouds. He had chariots of iron, He had a lineage of blood and bone that went back to the dawn of time. He called them desert fanatics and went back to his feast. But the wind carries secrets, and soon the rumors began to change. They didn't speak of Israel's military might, for they had none. They spoke of something far more unsettling. Travelers whispered of a Red Sea that had split open like a wound to let them pass. They spoke of the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt, the greatest empire on earth, swallowed whole without a single Israelite lifting a spear. They told stories of a mountain that smoked and a prophet whose face glowed with a terrifying light. Og tried to ignore it. He drowned the rumors in wine and noise. But then came the night the scout returned. The soldier was one of Og's best, a man who had seen blood and death without flinching. But now he stood before the giant king, trembling, his tunic stained with travel, his eyes wide with a primal terror. "They are coming, my king," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling torches. "But they are not like any army we have ever seen." Og leaned forward, his shadow engulfing the man. "Do they have siege engines? Do they have giants?" "No," the scout replied, shaking his head frantically. "They march and they sing. They do not shout threats. They declare victory before the battle begins. And their new leader, Joshua, he does not pace like a warlord. He stands still, as if the wind itself is waiting for his permission to blow." Og forced a laugh, a deep, rumbling sound meant to reassure his court, but for the first time the sound felt hollow in his own chest. Something buried deep beneath his armor, beneath layers of muscle and arrogance, began to tighten. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a child in the caverns: fear. That night, as the wind howled through the empty stone halls of his palace, the giant king stood alone by the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, but they couldn't warm the sudden chill that had settled in his bones. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was the chill of eternity drawing near. In Bashan, giants did not tremble. They made the earth tremble. But the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't peace, it was pressure. It was the kind of heavy electric silence that fills the air just before the dam breaks. The reports kept coming, unrelenting and impossible to ignore. Jericho had fallen, not by battering rams, but by the sound of trumpets and a shout. The Amorite kings had vanished into history. And this people, this Israel, they moved with a terrifying confidence. They walked as if they were not alone. One report said, "They do not fear death because they believe their God walks among them." What if their God is real? One of his generals had dared to ask during a strategy meeting. Og had struck him to the ground for the insolence. "We are Bashan," Og had roared. "We do not bow to wind and stories." But later, in the privacy of his chambers, Og stared at the eastern horizon and wondered, what kind of army prepares for war by worshipping? What kind of God fights battles with silence? The night before the battle, the tension in the palace was suffocating. Og ordered a feast to drown out the dread. Torches lined every wall, blazing fiercely against the encroaching dark. Drums pounded a frantic rhythm through the courtyards, shaking the dust from the stones. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat and flowing wine. To any observer, it looked like a celebration of strength, a display of unshakable power. But on the throne of iron, Og was quiet. He lifted his goblet, the same hand that had torn through enemy lines and crushed rebellions. But the grip was different now. It wasn't weaker, it was uncertain. His eyes kept drifting away from the dancers and the warriors, past the stone columns, out through the open arches to the valley below. There, in the distance, lay the camp of Israel. It was maddening. There were no bonfires raging in their camp, no sounds of swords being sharpened on whetstones, no drunken boasting of soldiers preparing to die. There was only a faint rhythmic sound rising like incense into the night sky. Singing, they were singing praises to a God they could not see, yet seemed to know intimately. A captain approached the throne, hesitant. "My king," he murmured, "they do not prepare like we do. They don't shout, they read, they pray. It is unnatural." Or didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was fixed on the iron bed beneath him. 13 feet of cold metal. For years it had been his pride, his symbol, his proof to the world that he was more than a man. But tonight, it felt different. It felt heavy. It felt less like a monument to his glory and more like a weight dragging him down. It felt like a cage he had built for himself. Abruptly, Og stood up, the movement silencing the musicians nearby. He left the feast, walking away from the light and the noise, climbing the stone stairs to the upper wall of his fortress. He needed to see them. He needed to understand. He walked along the ramparts, the wind whipping at his beard, sharp and biting. Below him, the land of Bashan lay silent, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Even the wild animals had fled the hills, sensing what the king refused to admit. Judgment was coming. Og gripped the cold stone of the wall and looked down. The camp of Israel was a sea of calm in a chaotic world. And in that moment, standing alone in the dark, the giant king felt it. It wasn't a wind, it wasn't a sound, it was a presence. A holy hush that seemed to press against his very soul. It was a conviction that pierced through his pride like a spear. He had mocked their stories. He had laughed at their God. But now, as the worship rose from the tents below, Og felt the terrifying realization that this was not a war of nations. This was not about territory. This was a reckoning. And for the first time in his life, the giant felt small. The night air atop the fortress of Edrei was usually filled with the sounds of a kingdom that never truly slept. The clatter of patrols, the distant roar of lions in the valley, the confident laughter of a people who believed themselves invincible. But tonight, the world had been stripped of its voice. The stars were hidden behind a thick, suffocating blanket of clouds, leaving the land below draped in an abyssal blackness. Yet, in that darkness, something moved. It wasn't a physical enemy creeping up the walls with grappling hooks. It was a presence. It was a weight that settled not on the shoulders, but on the soul. Og, the giant king of Bashan, stood alone on the ramparts, his massive hands gripping the cold stone until his knuckles turned white. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of intimidation, but what he felt now was not fear. It was something far more unsettling. It was conviction. It was the terrifying, quiet realization that the universe was not empty and that he was not its center. Before we witness the dawn that brought a giant to his knees, remember to subscribe to Guardians of the Covenant, like this video, and share it, because the story of Og is not just history. It is a mirror reflecting the battles we all face when pride meets truth. Og had mocked their stories. He had laughed when his spies told him of the slaves who escaped Egypt. He had dismissed their god as a desert myth, a crutch for the weak. But now, as a faint, rhythmic sound rose from the tents of Israel miles across the valley, Og felt a grip on his heart that no amount of armor could block. It wasn't the chaotic war cry of a barbarian horde, it was worship. A low, steady hum of thousands of voices singing in unison, rising like smoke, bypassing the walls of his fortress and piercing straight into his conscience. This was no war of nations. This was not a dispute over borders or water rights. This was a reckoning, a divine appointment written into the fabric of time long before Og drew his first breath. He turned away from the valley, the sound of that holy melody pursuing him down the stone corridors to his private chamber. There, resting against a pillar, was his sword. It was a monstrous weapon, forged of black iron, longer than most men were tall. It had severed the lineages of kings. It had carved the borders of Bashan. Og reached for it, needing the familiarity of its weight, the assurance of his own violence. But when his fingers closed around the hilt, it felt wrong. The steel felt dead in his hands. It felt alien, as if it no longer belonged to him, or perhaps as if he no longer belonged to the world where swords mattered. He looked east again, through the narrow slit of his window, and in the crushing darkness the giant whispered a prayer. It was not to God. He could not bring himself to name the one he had defied, but to the silence itself. "If I fall," he breathed, "let them remember I stood." But the silence gave no answer. There was only the wind, shifting now, carrying with it a pressure that made the air feel thin, as if the oxygen was being drawn out of the room by a massive intake of breath. The dawn did not break gently over Bashan. It split the sky like a wound. The sun rose over the basalt cliffs, not with warmth, but with a sharp, burning clarity. It was a blinding light that exposed every crack in the stone, every flaw in the armor. But the usual sounds of morning were gone. There were no birds calling from the oak trees. No breeze rustled the dry grass. Even the livestock in the lower city was silent. Nature itself seemed to have retreated, making way for something it dared not interrupt. Og stood once more on the high walls of Edrei, looking down. His warriors, thousands of them, were assembled in the valley below. They were a terrifying sight, swords polished to a mirror shine, armor strapped tight, shields interlocked like a wall of iron waves. They were the finest killers in the region. But none of them cheered, none of them banged their spears against their shields. They stood frozen, their eyes locked on the horizon, because Israel had come. They did not come with siege towers. They did not come with chariots of fire or thundering cavalry. They came in a line of men walking in unbroken formation, walking with a terrifying lack of fear. And then, rising like thunder from beneath the surface of the earth, came their voices again. It was worship, not noise, not threats, but reverence. It was faith turned into a sound wave, a frequency that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the fortress. Og felt it physically, a trembling beneath the stone that had nothing to do with geology and everything to do with holiness. Beside him, one of his high priests, a man who had spent decades reading the entrails of animals and casting dark spells, gasped and took a step back. "My king," the priest whispered, his face distinctively pale. "Heaven is watching." Og said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew that this was not just an army approaching, it was the atmosphere of God. And then he saw him. Separating from the front lines, a single figure walked forward. It was Joshua. He was not marching with the aggressive stride of a warlord. He was simply standing, his staff in hand, his eyes steady, his posture firm. He looked almost small against the backdrop of the valley, yet he cast a shadow that seemed to engulf the entire city. Behind him, though unseen by human eyes, moved a power that Og could no longer deny. The sword in Og's hand, the one he had retrieved from his chamber, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It dragged at his arm, resisting him, as if gravity itself had turned against him. His breath caught in his throat. His heart raced, hammering against his ribs, not with the adrenaline of courage, but with the suffocating rhythm of conviction. Then the wind shifted. It swept through the valley like a divine exhale, lifting the dust, bending the ancient trees, and pulling the sky downward. It was a holy hush. No trumpet sounded, no spear flew. For one singular suspended moment, all of creation paused, waiting for a command that would not come from the throat of a man, but from the throne of heaven. Og gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching tight, not out of anger, but out of a desperate, clawing dread. He had mocked this god. He had built a bed of iron to prove he was self-sufficient. Now he stood on holy ground, and Bashan, with all its stone, its pride, its iron, and its roar, trembled because the God of Israel had arrived. Og descended from the wall and walked out to the gates of Edrei. He stood there, the last barrier between his people and the judgment of the Almighty. He wore no crown. He carried no shield. He held only a sword that was too heavy and a silence that was too loud. Behind him, his warriors waited, their confidence shattering like glass. The drums of Bashan had gone quiet. The fires in the temples no longer roared. Even the wind seemed to stop just short of the fortress walls, respecting a boundary drawn by an invisible hand. Across the valley, the Israelites stopped. Every face turned toward Og, every voice hushed. Joshua walked forward alone. No shield, no blade, just the steady steps of a man who knew the battle was already won. Og felt it in his bones, a paralysis that started in his soul. He could charge. He knew the mechanics of killing. He had done it 1,000 times. He could swing the sword that had made kingdoms bow. But when he tried to raise his arm, his body betrayed him. The strength he had always trusted, the brute force that had been his god, vanished. His grip faltered. His knees, which had never bent to any man, began to shake violently. The great iron sword slipped from his fingers and hit the dust with a dull thud. It wasn't dropped by force. It was dropped by truth. He looked into Joshua's eyes and saw no hatred, no thirst for blood, only a blinding, terrifying truth. Og saw it then, clearer than the sun above him. This moment was never about Israel. It wasn't about land. It was about pride, his pride, meeting the holiness of God. The walls of Bashan had not yet crumbled, but they no longer listened to his voice. The iron throne behind him felt colder than the grave, not a seat of power, but a tomb of arrogance. Joshua raised his hand, not to strike, but to seal what heaven had already decreed. The earth trembled, not from war machines, but from the weight of judgment. The cracks in Bashan began from within the heart of its king. Og took one step, not to fight, not to flee, but to fall. He dropped to his knees, his hands, once the instruments of empire, now open and empty. His breath came in shallow gasps, his face pressed into the dirt of the land he thought he owned, and the giant fell. He did not fall to a spear. He did not fall to a tactic. He fell to the presence of the God he had once mocked. The last of the Rephaim was no longer standing, because when true holiness arrives, no flesh can boast. The battlefield remained still. There were no cries of triumph from Israel, no songs of conquest, only a silence that was heavy and holy. The gates of Bashan hung open, shattered not by battering rams, but by surrender. The iron throne stood untouched in the palace, its shadow long and cold. Og was gone. But the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The people of Bashan emerged slowly, their eyes wide, their hearts uncertain. They looked not to Joshua, not to the Israelites, but to the empty space where their king had stood. The one who was supposed to be unshakable had fallen without a blade being raised. Og's sword lay in the dirt, half buried, unclaimed by any victor. His bed of iron still stood silent and bare beneath the broken roof of his hall. It no longer declared power. It whispered a warning to the ages. An elder priest of Bashan, trembling in the aftermath, broke the silence with a voice frail with awe. "Leave it," he said, pointing to the iron bed. "Let the world remember what happens when man builds without the fear of God." And they did. Israel did not loot the bed. They did not melt it down for weapons or carry it off as a trophy of war. They walked through Bashan with reverence, heads bowed, eyes low. This was not their glory, this was God's judgment. Even the land seemed to respond. The skies cleared, the trees stilled, and the animals returned, as if the air itself had been lifted, as if the crushing weight of human arrogance had finally been rolled away. The once mighty cities of Bashan would never be rebuilt to their former glory. No new king would rise from Og's ashes to challenge the heavens. His people dispersed, his legacy dissolved, not in a firestorm of destruction, but in the crushing weight of silence. Because what fell that day was not just a man, it was an idea. The idea that strength can stand on its own without God. The idea that pride makes a better foundation than faith. For generations, the Israelites would tell this story, not as a victory of military prowess, but as the moment heaven stepped onto the earth. The story would be told again and again, not of Og the ruler, but of Og the warning. From his ruins, one truth would echo down the corridors of history. No fortress is too strong, no throne is too high, and no king is too mighty that the Lord cannot humble him in a single breath. After all the noise faded, after the dust settled and the warriors had vanished into history, one object remained. Og's bed, iron, immense, cold, 13 feet long, nearly 6 feet wide, too massive for comfort, too heavy for any ordinary man. It had been forged as a monument to intimidate, to say, "Here lies one beyond comparison." But now, standing beneath the open sky, it was a grave of a legacy, a stark reminder that when we build our lives on pride, we are only building our own ruins.